What can you say about the Marvel Cubematic universe? I, I wrote Cubematic in the script. What can you say about the Marvel Cinematic Universe? My all-time favorite movie franchise, nearly a decade old and still going strong with 14 movies in the bunch, ranging anywhere from disposable but enjoyable popcorn fun to some downright masterpieces. But in my opinion, which are which? Thanks to a request, this is now a question I seriously have to consider, though seeing as I'm horrible at picking favorites, it's not gonna be easy to answer. What that also means is that this is subject to change. Not drastically, but don't be shocked if the next time I list off favorites from this franchise, things are switched around a bit. But as of the time of this recording, this is my definitive opinion on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, from worst to best. I guess this is the first real ranking video I've done. How about that? Regardless, my opinion isn't going to be yours, so don't react too negatively if I place a movie in a spot you don't think it deserves. Also, keep in mind that I'm basing this off of my most recent watch-through of these films. I plan to marathon them all relatively soon, but as for the purposes of this list, it might have been a little while since I've seen one, and I might like it more or less if I were to look at it more recently. I'm also generally not going to go into too much depth, since I'm going to have way more opportunities to talk about these films in the future. That said, I might get into some spoiler territory, so maybe be careful if you haven't seen these films. Okay, enough stalling, let's get it on!
We are not gods. We're born, we live, we die, just as humans do.
Give or take 5,000 years.
Starting with what I hope is the obvious choice for worst in the franchise, Thor: The Dark World is kind of a mess. To me, its biggest crime, outside of having by far the worst villain in any of these movies, is that Thor himself doesn't have much in the way of an arc. Now, not every movie demands that an explicit and detailed character arc be present, but it's been a consistent element of the films in this franchise, and its absence leads to a lack of focus. The Dark World jumps all over the place, to the point that it often feels like Loki or Jane's movie before it's Thor's. The issue with Thor is that as a character, he's never been as compelling as he was in his first movie. While he has hints of character progression in both Avengers films, he's so far the member of the core cast with the least of it, and that his own standalone sequel exemplifies that best is a problem. He and his father Odin butt heads a bit, but it's only in one or two scenes, and by the end of the film, Thor comes to a conclusion about it that I'm not totally sold on. There's a boatload of things between Thor and Odin that need to be unpacked, and the movie suffers for not making the struggle between the two of them and Loki even more the focus than it was in the previous film. Instead, what we get is a movie that's trying way too hard to cover way too many bases. Like the other films in Phase 2, it has to play as Fallout from the Avengers, which is simple enough given the antagonist to that film is a main character in this one, but it also tries to be more action-packed than the first Thor film, handle the presence of an Infinity Stone, introduce and utilize a new villain whose backstory and powers take some time to explain, make more use of the grand fantasy stuff, but also drag the human characters back into it because their absence after such a big part in the first film would feel a bit conspicuous. I'll talk more about Selvig, Darcy, and Jane a bit later on, since most of what I have to say about them applies to both movies, but needless to say, I don't like that Selvig is played totally for goofy comic relief. His appearance here feels obligatory, and if they were just going to use him for cheap laughs, I'd honestly rather they cut him entirely. The point here is that the movie is just trying to be too much, and even though charismatic performances, decent action, and some interesting concepts, and the few bits of compelling character drama that are allowed to eke out keep the movie from failing per se, it's ultimately unimpressive, and until Ragnarok comes along in nearly a year's time and finally shows us the fallout from this film, it's the most superfluous and disposable of the whole bunch.
It's about legacy. It's about what we choose to leave behind for future generations.
If we want to talk about movies that are buoyed almost entirely by decent performances and action scenes, Iron Man 2 is the next logical step. I'm honestly not sure if I'm right to put this movie above The Dark World, since I think I Am 2 is the more incomprehensible of them. Yeah, that's mostly because of all the Avengers lead-in stuff, and while this film doesn't feel nearly as much like an extended Avengers trailer as it was accused of being upon release, especially in comparison to more recent attempts at universe building and sequel baiting in other franchises, the sudden official introduction to Nick Fury at about 3/4 of the way into the film still can't help but feel like a massive detour from the story that was previously taking place. Not to mention likely very confusing if you're not the type of person who sticks around after the credits and went into this film not even knowing who Fury is. Fury himself, as well as Natasha Romanoff, would become more interesting characters in the future, and it's good to have them here so that we can have a clearer view of their characters before future events change them big time. But their presence feels like it's bringing the rest of the film to a dead halt, and in the context of this movie, reads more like advertising or comics fan service than anything else. Iron Man 2 has perhaps the prototypical example of a weak, middle-of-the-road villain. There will be worse villains in better movies, but Ivan Vanko and Justin Hammer are pretty meh. I actually intend to do a series of videos all about the MCU villains, so I'll expand on those two more at a later date, but the fact that both of them do almost nothing for the entire second act of the film contributes a lot to its structural issues. Though to be fair, those issues can also be pinned on the amount of improv comedy that doesn't work as well here as it did in the first film. I still chuckled a moderate amount, but too often the jokes feel like padding rather than quick and natural gags, and this affects the characterization. Tony Stark spends most of the movie afraid that he's about to die, and this means turning all of his worst and best traits up to 11 in an attempt to live life to the fullest for as long as he can. This downward spiral means that he and love interest Pepper Potts get into quite a few spats, and in my opinion these scenes are played way too much for bickering married couple comedy to the point that both of them feel almost like caricatures. Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow are doing enough to keep the characters likable, and I also like the introduction of Don Cheadle as Rhodes, giving the character much more of a military air than Terrence Howard did. And even though I just complained about their characters, I also can't deny that Sam Rockwell and Mickey Rourke both have great screen presence. The one thing I'll give IM2 over Dark World is that it's much clearer about its themes, and it's certainly more of a character study for Tony than Dark World was for Thor. It's still probably the character of Tony at his weakest, mainly because, like everything else, his descent into alcoholism is played up as too much of a gag, on top of going by too fast. But it's got enough going for it that I'd sit down and enjoy it if it were on TV or something. It's not a very solid film, though, and I think it suffers from being the designated Avengers hype-up movie. Like The Dark World, this is honestly one that I'm comfortable telling people that they can skip.
Unworthy of these realms, unworthy of your title! You're unworthy!
I don't want anyone to think I enjoy picking on Thor. Ragnarok is my most anticipated superhero film of the year, and I'm holding out hope for it to be the character's first great movie. As it stands, though considerably better than its sequel in my opinion, the first Thor still suffers a lot from similar problems. Looking at it critically, Thor is in a bit of a weird place compared to all the other films. I've watched this movie in its entirety 3 or 4 times, and each time has been a radically different viewing experience. After my most recent viewing, I think I'm comfortable saying that while it has more good than the previous 2 films, it also has more bad. The pace feels a bit too fast for its own good. It feels like I blinked and then suddenly we're at the climax. This is a movie that could have done with a lot more time dedicated to really fleshing out its characters. Thor himself has a pretty good arc, and everything I've said about Chris Hemsworth in The Dark World applies here. Stellan Skarsgård gets to play Selvig is far more dignified in this film than he does in the sequel, and for what time he has, Selvig is a pretty effective supporting character. I've never been as annoyed by Darcy Lewis as many other people seem to. Kat Dennings in general I've always found kinda harmless, but she really is superfluous in every sense of the word. The movie has a decent enough sense of humor without her in it, and she doesn't really contribute to the dynamic at all. So far, these bottom 3 movies always have a trend of going a bit overboard with the comedy, but Darcy is the only example of an entire character who could be erased from existence and have nothing be lost. Jane Foster is often seen as one of the more disposable MCU love interests, and unfortunately I have to agree. Conceptually, I think the relationship between she and Thor is pretty great, and if I'm being honest, I think the problem is Natalie Portman. Not to knock Miss Portman, but in these movies she's playing it really generic and not elevating the writing the same way everyone else is. I like the Asgardian characters, particularly Heimdall and Odin, mainly because of the performances, but Sif and the Warriors 3 could have used far more time to leave any impact. I think it's a bit sad that after 2 theatrical appearances, the most character I've gotten from any of these guys is Sif's appearances on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Speaking of S.H.I.E.L.D., recurring character Agent Coulson is back, and I like how he gets to be played as somewhat of an antagonist, showing the character has some versatility. The biggest bright spot as far as the characters go is Loki. Tom Hiddleston's performance really is worthy of all the praise this character gets, and all of the movie's best scenes, I dare say their only truly compelling scenes, involves either he, Hemsworth, Hopkins, or Elba. If I'm not talking about character, then this movie's biggest problem is a lack of action. There's I guess you could say 3.5 action scenes through the whole film, and Thor doesn't even have his powers for one of them, so I hesitate to count it. The 2 action scenes where he does have his powers are really well choreographed, but one is edited kinda choppy and the other isn't very well lit. Future films would give us a better display of Thor in action, but as far as this film goes, it's kind of a letdown to have what little action there is be mostly unimpressive. Other little things bother me a bit, like how the little town in New Mexico where Thor lands always feels like a set. None of the buildings seem real, and I never get the impression anyone is living there. Combine that with how little we get to see of Asgard, and the whole movie feels quite small in scale, which clearly isn't what it's going for with all the drama and flash and sweeping musical score. Overall, Thor is a better told story than the previous 2 films, but not as good as it could have been given the setup. I hesitate to tell anyone to skip it because the good things that are there are really worth sitting down and watching it, but take it with a grain of salt.
You, my friend, are a hero. Don't hide from your power.
Given that he's easily the Avenger with the most pop culture presence prior to the start of this Cubematic universe, it only figures that I'd have a bit of a soft spot for the Incredible Hulk. That being the case, I find it fitting that starting with this film we are emphatically in good movie territory, and I'm going to have far more positive than negative to say with the next 11 entries on this list. I actually had a real hard time placing this and the next 2 entries relative to each other, so maybe consider this chunk of the list all equal in my eyes. What we have with The Incredible Hulk is a suspense thriller mixed with a monster movie, basically an episode of the old Bill Bixby television show stretched out to feature length. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of why this movie works is just a keen eye for tone and feel. Yeah, there's the pretty decent action. Edward Norton, though not my favorite Bruce Banner, is giving a really solid performance. Bruce himself has a clear and simple character arc about seeing the Hulk first as something to eradicate, then something to control, and there's even some interesting but not fully explored themes about the abuse of science. But for the most part, what makes the film a good sit and unique in the MCU is that it effectively manages to feel like a natural mix of the Wolfman and Eagle Eye. Right up to the climax, the movie is essentially just a week in the life of Bruce Banner, and is appropriately tense with very little levity, sparse and utilitarian dialogue, and long stretches where Bruce is in a constant state of never being allowed to relax. It's a razor-thin wire for a character to have to tightrope, and that feeling is communicated really well, and when the Hulk does finally come out, at least for the first half of the film, he accurately feels like a terrifying, inhuman force that no one in the scene is safe around. It's to the point that I like the Hulk scenes better as universal horror massacres than as superhero set pieces. This film handles its action better than Thor and Iron Man 2 do. By the way, how fitting is it that those 3 films are right on top of each other in this list, considering they all take place at roughly the same time. But they're still not the most impressive fights in the franchise. If action spectacle is what you're looking for, this film is only marginally better than the Ang Lee Hulk, and I don't think we get any truly great use of this character in an action scene until the Avengers. That said, I don't want to undersell the characters here, since I do like them. Barring General Ross and Bruce himself, none of them have reappeared since this film, and I think that's a shame. Especially for Tim Roth and Tim Blake Nelson as Emil Blonsky and Samuel Stearns. The latter isn't one of the best villains in the MCU, but both of these characters are effective foils for Bruce that I'd have liked to see again in some capacity. Stearns is also just a fun shot of enthusiasm, the sort of comic relief who's in the film just long enough to lighten it up, but also an interesting character in his own right and not remotely obnoxious. Liv Tyler as Betty Ross I can't actually remember much of, but she and Norton have a decent chemistry, and I'm invested enough that I at least feel a little bit bad for where the relationship is left by the end. Overall, it's a good watch. Not exactly a fun movie per se, but probably the best that anyone could have done given the Hulk on the run from the military is a pretty basic storyline. Frankly, I don't think it gets enough credit for being as solid as it is.
Everything that you know. And love. Gone forever.
Speaking of movies that feel unique, albeit less so, number 10 is AntMan. As the first real foray of the big-budget superhero film into the heist genre, a lot of its novelty comes from how that genre lends to a different structure than what we're used to. Honestly, when I think about it, it feels kinda weird that this is a superhero movie all about prepping for, building toward, and pulling off one big mission as opposed to an ongoing conflict with multiple battles. Paul Rudd is so inherently likable that it's kind of easy to ignore that Scott Lang's character arc is something that could have used another pass-over. There's definitely an idea present, i.e. that Scott is the kind of guy who takes the easy way out of any problem and might be putting his desire to be with his daughter ahead of her actual well-being. But the movie doesn't talk enough about those things, and as a result, Scott comes off the way Thor does in The Dark World, a character who's basically got it all figured out and whose conflicts are entirely external. Likewise, Evangeline Lilly as Hope Van Dyne is sympathetic and played well, and her defrosting toward both Scott and her father makes for a nice dynamic, but there's not too much to say about her that isn't ultimately in service of Michael Douglas as Hank Pym. Yellow Jacket is another okay villain with a decently intimidating presence and a really cool design once he's in the suit. His big issue as far as I'm concerned is that he's an antagonist for Hank but not Scott. There's hints of a rapport between he and Scott in the one extended sequence in which they get to interact, but they're just barely foils for each other. And have you noticed a pattern yet? Yeah, for all intents and purposes, this is Hank Pym's movie. If it weren't for the fact that Scott has all the action scenes, I don't even think it would be in question. Yes, the movie is aiming to make them shared protagonists, but too much of the meat is on Hank. Thankfully, the movie offsets this with a light, breezy tone that makes the relatively little substance feel kinda natural, with every character getting a couple decent laughs in, especially Michael Pena as Luis, and some really creative use of Ant-Man's powers go a long way as well. The climax in particular is one of the better cinematic superhero battles of all time, and seems to have started a trend in these movies where the studio seems bent on making their third acts in particular as distinct as possible. It's incredibly off-kilter, and this scene along with Luis' hilarious tangents are when the movie feels most like an Edgar Wright joint. On that note, it's sad that Wright left the project, but his name is still on it and I think that's warranted given how I can spot some of his fingerprints still on this. I would have loved to see an MCU film that was really inundated with his signature dialogue and editing style, but I am happy with what we have. Ant-Man is perhaps Marvel at its fluffiest. Crowd-pleasing popcorn fare that's executed well but without much depth, and a textbook example of endearing characters and unique action carrying a film.
I saw young Americans killed by the very weapons I created to defend them and protect them. And I saw that I had become part of a system that is comfortable with zero accountability.
I can't tell you how many lists like this I've seen with the original Iron Man on or around the #1 spot, mainly for being the thing that started it all. Clearly, though, I think it's one of the weaker entries. I can't tell you how I felt about this movie upon its release, partly because my memory isn't that good, but mainly because it was so overshadowed by The Dark Knight in terms of comic book films of 2008 that I hardly remember my viewing experience with it. Watching it in the context of what's come afterward, it's still a pretty solid movie, but hardly anywhere near as good as this franchise gets. The story of Tony Stark's redemption for his days in weapons manufacturing is compelling, but it's complete before we've even reached the third act, which means the back end of the film is a lot of not much going on. Not helping is that the villain, Obadiah Stane, though well acted by Jeff Bridges and decently charismatic, has a plan that's so generic I honestly don't remember any of it. So by the end of the film, there's not much thematic heft in taking him down, he's just an external threat. Also on my list of things that doesn't quite work out is Terrence Howard as Rhodey. It's not a bad performance, but after seeing Don Cheadle in the role, Howard just doesn't seem the right person for the character as written. But enough of the bad stuff. What really works about the movie's story is basically the first two-thirds. Tony is introduced in a way that makes him immediately compelling. His kidnap and forced labor at the hands of the Ten Rings is extremely visceral and remarkably grounded, especially for what this universe would become. For at least a second, you can believe that Stark's suits are something that could be made in reality, and that combined with the largely ad-lib dialogue creates an easy investment in the world. Let's be real though, the big thing that puts this movie over Incredible Hulk and Ant-Man is Robert Downey Jr. That's about it. Yes, Gwyneth Paltrow and Jeff Bridges are also elevating their material, and Terrence Howard is perfectly serviceable, but this film is a one-man show, and with a lesser actor as the main event, it would probably be 3 spaces back on the list. Even forgetting all of Downey's personal baggage leading up to this role, this is a career-making performance, and the main reason that Iron Man is an engaging and more than passable film, even when its plot is stretching for reasons to keep going.
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
And just like that, we've made the jump from movies I like to movies I love. I love Captain America: The First Avenger. I love how it effectively sells Captain America as both a person you could meet in reality and a too-good-to-be-true moral pillar Boy Scout. I love Chris Evans in the role. I love that unlike the previous attempts at adapting this character in live action, it's not remotely ashamed to be a full-on stylized period piece. I love Peggy Carter. I love Howard Stark. Hell, I love how much of a stroke of genius it was to make Howard Stark and Steve Rogers friends in the first place. I love how 40s the action choreography and musical score feels. This movie is so good. But it wouldn't be number 8 if it were perfect, so of course there are some things I don't quite love. The Red Skull is by no means a bad villain, and he's played brilliantly, but his brand of pure power-hungriness isn't the type of motive I find very engaging. Of a bit more import is how the third act, basically everything after the loss of Bucky, seems like it's going through the motions. The whole movie is a straightforward adventure, but the build to the climax in particular feels like a lot of plot and action, but not much story. I feel like I should have more to say, but the good parts of this movie are just so good! On any other list, I'd feel bad for putting something this good this low, but on this list, it's just a testament to my love of this franchise. More so than Thor or even the first Iron Man, this film gets points for making me care about a character that I never had previously, and it never ceases to make me smile. Of all these movies, this one is the most uplifting. If you just need to feel good, if you just want a fun, earnest, relatively lighthearted and simple war flick that's also a superb character piece, look no further.
Now I'm standing. You all happy? We're all standing up now. Bunch of jackasses standing in a circle.
Okay, I suppose this also works on the level of fun, earnest, relatively lighthearted and simple action flick and character piece. I really struggled for a bit whether to place this over First Avenger. Both have story problems, or more accurately, a story problem that in the case of Guardians is more potentially deal-breaking than First Avenger's wonky third act. Namely, the Guardians themselves are all endearing, funny, bizarre characters, but whether or not I buy their coming together as a fan family when they do, varies. It feels like we're missing out on key moments of team building for them to be so attached to each other as they are by the end of the second act. But at the same time, it's hard not to look at this group of people who might be legitimately disturbed and say, of course their coming together was never going to feel entirely natural the way it would for people who actually understand social interaction. The villain, again, is also a problem, and I think definitely worse than Red Skull. Ronan has an arguably more interesting motive with his religious zealotry, but he's not particularly imposing, doesn't have any memorable dialogue outside of one line, and the makeup and costumes seem to stop the actor from adding anything to his performance. That said, this film's makeup and costumes are awesome! Visually, this is one of, if not the most colorful and striking film in the franchise. When I saw it in theaters, I remember being particularly awestruck by this scene. Part of that is a score by Tyler Bates, one of the best scores in the MCU, even independent of the impeccable bit of characterization that is the awesome mix. Guardians of the Galaxy is a bit like AntMan Plus. What it lacks in depth or complexity, it makes up for in charm and technicals, just like that film, but to an even greater extent. It's hilarious and unique, and that goes a long way to explaining why these formerly C-list characters quickly became some of the studio's most popular. Bring on Volume 2.
What did you just do to me?
I pushed your astral form out of your physical form.
What's in that tea? Psilocybin? LSD?
It's just tea. With a little honey.
Oh, this was a hard one. While there hardly seems to be anyone who actively dislikes Doctor Strange, at least for reasons that don't have to do with whitewashing and whatnot, I think I might be the only person on the planet who'd place it above Guardians. And to be fair, it's not like Guardians doesn't have some things over this film. Doctor Strange doesn't make me laugh nearly as much, for as visually amazing as it is, it's not quite as colorful. Doctor Strange makes me really invested in one protagonist, while Guardians did it for a whole group, yada yada. But on the storytelling and thematic level, I've gotta give it to Strange. Stephen Strange's personal journey just resonates more for me than any other origin story. His change is a pretty substantial one, and despite most of it happening over the course of a single day in the second and third acts, I completely buy it. The second act might actually be my favorite in the film, another way in which I'm in the minority. Don't get me wrong, I agree with all the praise heaped on the climax for being unique by the standards of the genre, but my favorite part of the movie is always a string of scenes where Strange interacts with Mordo, the Ancient One, the villain Caecilius, and his kinda not really kinda love interest Christine. It's here where the film is heaviest on dialogue, which is my jam. It's this utilization of the supporting cast that I think is missing in things like Thor, and why I have a hard time agreeing with people who call Christine and Caecilius weak roles. They're hardly the best of the franchise in terms of villain and love interest, but the story benefits a lot from having them both in it. Plus, even the worst characters would be elevated by the likes of Mads Mikkelsen, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Tilda Swinton, and Benedict Cumberbatch. BD Wong is cool too. I don't know, like, I just reviewed this movie? It's over here. I'm running out of things to say without repeating myself. Sorry. Doctor Strange! Cool themes! Great acting, a bit slow in the beginning, great visual effects. I like it a lot.
And my suits, they're
Machines.
they're part of me.
A distraction.
Maybe.
Is he serious? He can't be for real, right? This has to be a troll video. Yeah, where is it? Is it April 1st already? No orthodontist or reconstructive surgeons needed today, folks. I love Iron Man 3, really and truly. Getting this out of the way now, I don't care about the Mandarin. I'm sure it must have sucked to be an Iron Man fan in the comics, hear months in advance that one of the character's more fantastical villains was going to show up, and then be bitterly disappointed when that's not really what he is at all, but get over it? What the Mandarin ultimately is perfect for the political themes of this film, and this is lesson number 1 in letting go of source material if it makes for a more interesting movie. That's not all it has going for it, of course. As someone who's only recently gotten a taste for Shane Black's stuff because of this movie, his stamp is undeniably all over this film. And because of that, it's another one that feels structurally and tonally unique. There are a lot of moments in this movie that wouldn't feel out of place in an R-rated film, and that includes a few of the more morbid comedic moments. The politics and the style would only mean so much if there wasn't a compelling central character journey, though. And this movie is, in my opinion, the best arc that Tony Stark has had over the course of a single film. The portrayal of his trauma, the way it comes through in everything from his panic attacks to his bravado to his relationship with Pepper to his suits is handled perfectly. Speaking of the suits, this is also the most creativity that's been put into Iron Man in terms of action in any of these movies. You've got fights where Tony isn't in the suit, you've got scenes where his suit is hardly working, scenes where he only has an arm and a leg, scenes where he doesn't have a suit at all and has to improvise, and all of this goes a long way to bolstering the movie's thesis statement that it's Tony himself and not the suit that makes him an awesome hero. Not only is this movie satisfying in such a way that it would have been an effective end to Robert Downey Jr.'s stint as the character, but also in such a way that it's basically the ground that all of his appearances since have been building off of. Add to that Paltrow and Cheadle doing great as always, Guy Pearce as yet another villain that I think is pretty underrated, and unconventional plays on the studio-mandated child sidekick trope, commentary on the malleable nature of politics and media by greed, and yeah, I honestly don't get the hate surrounding this one. I urge anyone who immediately dismissed this film because of the Mandarin twist or because it wasn't enough like the other movies or whatever to give it another shot and judge it on its own terms. It might surprise you.
You're missing the point. There's no throne. There is no version of this where you come out on top. Maybe your army comes, and maybe it's too much for us, but it's all on you. Because if we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn well sure we'll avenge it.
This is it. 4 years, 5 previous movies, all building up to an explosion of a film with an ensemble cast made up of characters who, prior to the MCU experiment, would never be placed in one movie together by any studio that didn't want to alienate a general audience. Of all the many things the Avengers accomplishes, the one that I don't think it gets nearly enough credit for is how, for better or worse, it completely changed the nature of major Hollywood blockbusters. In simplest terms, the Avengers is for this decade what The Matrix was for the previous. Particularly in terms of tone, Joss Whedon's signature brand of too witty by half, thoroughly modern dialogue, and borderline Looney Tunes level slapstick is way more common than it was a decade ago. Even in movies that for the most part want to be taken seriously and have genuine stakes. Not to mention the effect that this film has had on the way we talk about movies. If you need any evidence of that, just try and think back to how many times you heard the term solo movie prior to 2012. Then, of course, there's a build to a bombastic extended climax that's become to many people the bane of the action genre, but again, whether you liked it or not, Any movie that managed to have this much lasting influence on the way that we make movies had to have been doing something right, and if you ask me, what the Avengers does right is pretty much everything. In a genre driven almost entirely by character and action, Avengers has some of the most eclectic characterization and satisfying action around. Everyone is written on point compared to their previous outings. Black Widow and Nick Fury are expanded to the point where they're easily competing with the others in terms of presence, but Mark Ruffalo is beyond a shadow of a doubt the MVP, both as the Hulk and as Bruce Banner. I would say the best moments of the movie are his, but really this whole film is something of a parade of best moments. But seriously, his character along with Black Widow are perhaps the best examples of Whedon's ability to endear me to characters, seeing as I care about the both of them way more than I ever did before coming out of this movie. Now I can't get enough of these guys. And of course, who could forget the living estrogen catnip that is Loki? Believe it or not, I actually had this film under Doctor Strange and Iron Man 3 for the longest time while making this list, and Loki is really what put this one over those two in the end. He's the one villain in these movies that everyone seems to agree on. He's funny and sympathetic, but effectively menacing. He's complex, but written in such a way that Tom Hiddleston gets to have a ball, hamming up the arch, mustache-twirling aspects of his personality. He gets at least one moment of perfect back and forth with everyone in the film except Hawkeye, and it's his overwhelming personality that really makes it okay that the aliens we fight for the entire third act are essentially featureless. If the Avengers has any serious flaws, they're more than made up for by its characters, and by extension the story told through them. For as much oppressive amount of time might be spent on action, the Avengers had and continues to have an insane amount of success and influence for a reason. And given how much was riding on it, perhaps the best victory is how much it manages to avoid feeling like a patchwork of studio notes. It's just really good. It's good. I like it, okay? I really...
When history did not cooperate, history was changed. We won, Captain. Your death amounts to the same as your life, a zero sum.
Yeah, it was pretty much a given that this would be high up. Ask anyone but me and this would probably be number one. Captain America the Winter Soldier thrusts its title character into the 21st century hard, ironically through the tropes of 70s spy thrillers, and in doing so expands his role from the first film as the ideal of America who has to struggle against a very not ideal state of the actual America around him. I think everyone knows what the deal with Hydra is at this point, but in case you don't, I'll stay mostly vague so as not to ruin the flawless way this movie executes that twist. Let's just say that the concept of the American ideal of freedom and good intentions being brought nearly to his knees by remnants of literal Nazis within the establishment makes us far and away the most relevant comic book movie on Earth in 2017. The bleak color palette and extreme amounts of tension within the film are kept from being oppressive, mainly because the movie does come down on the side of hope over cynicism, and it's the dynamic of this film's philosophy that I'd use as Exhibit A in regards to how culturally relevant this genre can be. Even as someone who dug the first Avenger, I wasn't going into its sequel expecting it to be the massive game changer it was for the franchise. It hasn't shaped the films or TV shows going forward as much as the Avengers did, but it's a tighter narrative and a better example of direction and focus. It's serious without being dour, it perfectly furthers characters like Black Widow and Fury, along with introducing Anthony Mackie as the Falcon in what's probably the most natural and endearing way anyone on Earth could have pulled that off. Robert Redford as Alexander Pierce is a great villain, though my favorite scene has to go to Toby Jones. The action is fun while still serving story at every opportunity. Really the only issue with it is that the title character doesn't leave nearly the impression that everyone else does, but it's not like he leaves none. It's a truly great film building on what came before, but capable of standing on its own should you choose to view it that way. Believe the hype, folks.
We need to plan something for Carl's birthday next week. He says you promised him an Xbox. He's very excited. I'm going to bed. I love you. Come home soon.
I don't think even the people who adored the first Avenger upon release came out of it expecting that its two sequels would handily be some of the best works in the entire superhero genre. Where The Winter Soldier is the tightest in terms of plot, Captain America Civil War is the more emotionally engaging of the two for me. The character parallels and philosophical conflict between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark is something that's been steadily building even across movies that only feature one of the two of them. And Civil War functions spectacularly as the climax of that troubled relationship. With that said, I am one of those people who will argue in favor of this being a Captain America movie before it's Avengers 2.5. It is, like the last entry, a story about Steve Rogers, though tragically what it has to say about Steve as a person runs counter to Winter Soldier in a lot of ways. This is the incorruptible man finally letting himself go too far, and everything that every other character does is ultimately about building to those moments. Of course, I'm not going to pretend that what makes this movie feel so momentous, especially since the main takeaway from its source material was that the surface-level gimmick of superheroes fighting each other does not an inherently epic story make, is that Civil War really is informed by everything that came before it. Well, everything except the Thor movies, maybe. And I do mean everything, since Civil War is perhaps the ultimate example of what makes the MCU so great in execution. Outside material can enhance a particular film, but they're not necessarily mandatory viewing. Vision's argument in support of the Sokovia Accord seems a bit more justified when you know about the Purple Man, or the hundreds and hundreds of Inhumans running around. Scott Lang's relevance to the themes of responsibility, its relationship with the law, and family become a lot clearer if you know what the deal is with his family and his history of fighting the system. Secretary Ross's intentions and the potential dark side of the Accords is more pronounced if you've seen exactly the kind of person he is before. Plot developments that center around Peggy Carter and Howard Stark hold a lot more emotional weight if you've been seeing those two characters get fully fleshed out and go on their own adventures outside of film appearances. But despite all that being the case, you really don't need to have seen Jessica Jones, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Ant-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and Agent Carter for Civil War to function as a piece. And as a piece, it's awesome. Cap is as compelling as always. For the first time in these movies, I'm truly invested in Bucky Barnes. Everyone else has a clear character and theme-based reason for being there, including the three big newcomers in the form of Spider-Man, Black Panther, and the new villain, Helmut Zemo. Zemo is one of my favorite villains, plot conveniences be darned, and Spidey is so far my favorite live-action take on the character, but the standout of the three is Chadwick Boseman. I want this guy's movie right now! Not only does he look amazing, but Boseman and the script are both delivering some major gravitas that none of the other main protagonists in this franchise really have. I want more of all of these guys, like now please. Civil War is maybe the biggest that any of these films have gotten so far in terms of pure raw emotionality, and appropriately it also gets the biggest fireworks show of anything on the planet. The airport fight scene has been lauded as the best action scene in any comic book film, maybe one of the best pieces of action spectacle in a film period, and well, yeah. At the very least, it's tied with the climax of the Avengers as the most emotionally satisfying bit of bombast in this franchise, and that's saying a lot. A lot of comic book fans want to compare the best of superhero film action scenes to literal comic panels being put up on the screen, and this is the first time in a theater that I've had that experience. Like, someone do me a favor and remind me to start a GoFundMe or Patreon page so I can raise the money necessary to commission every frame of this sequence drawn by Alex Ross. If I can remain in shallow land for just a second, I think it's helped by the fact that this movie also has the best version of everyone's costumes. Everyone. But yeah, that's Civil War, a movie so good it would have been worth the other 12 being awful just to get here. Even though I'm not really sure that would make any sense, I'm just gonna shut up, okay? Cool.
They're doomed.
Yes. But a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. It's a privilege to be among them.
You're unbearably naive.
Holy balls. If Iron Man 3 at number 5 didn't guarantee like 50 million dislikes, this movie at number 1 is definitely gonna do it. Age of Ultron might not reach the emotional highs of Civil War, and its plot might not be as tight as The Winter Soldier, but thematically I consider it pretty much a masterpiece. I've heard it said that AOU is inferior to Civil War as a thematic follow-up to the Avengers, and I respectfully disagree. After a first film all about embracing the simple, idealistic, old-fashioned notion of the superhero, Age of Ultron deepens this theme, with questions of what they really want, what their values really are, and whether or not that makes them true heroes. Before Civil War can display the government turning the team against itself with their morality as an excuse for outside control, Ultron gets to the heart of the question about whether or not the Avengers are really a force for good, whether their existence has really changed anything, or whether they're simply perpetuating a series of global conflict. Are the Avengers a force for peace, or are they such a band of screwed up misfits that conflict will follow them forever? Is the team a bunch of monsters, and how can they prove otherwise if saving the world from aliens wasn't enough? Age of Ultron is the final confirmation that everyone on this team has their heart in the right place, and is in a way a perfect commentary on why we have superheroes. Speaking of those heroes, everyone is on top form here, and with the team now acclimated to each other, each of the character interactions work even better than they did in the original film. The dialogue in Age of Ultron is less instantly quotable, but I think that speaks to it sounding more like natural conversation between friends. And by the end of the film, I buy that these guys have gone from co-workers to a surrogate family just in time for Civil War, the importance of family and roots being another major theme of the film. There's not a single dynamic in this film that I don't love, and yes, that includes the much-maligned romance between Hulk and Black Widow. Much like the first film, Age of Ultron is about developing the team as a unit, and it's as a collective that they function in the role of protagonist. Everyone's character gets furthered, including Hawkeye, who, given the opportunity, blossoms into a really interesting and endearing character. On the surface, it seems like he's given a lot to do solely to compensate for getting so little material in previous appearances, but he's actually the core of the movie, and he serves that purpose gamely. Our antagonist is also an element that's met with many complaints, and I gotta say, now more than ever, I don't get it. Ultron is, to me, the best villain in these movies, maybe only outclassed by Heath Ledger's Joker as far as villains in general. He doesn't have the instant parallels with every individual team member that Loki does, but he's morally complex and hilarious in a way that makes me prefer him to Loki. Plus, James Spader's performance knocks absolutely everything else out of the park and into space. You know what, forget it, he pulls a regular show and knocks the park into space too. Other part-time antagonists Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, while I wish the latter got more to do, serve an awesome purpose as far as the story goes, and the movie would lose so much if you were to cut either of their scenes even a little bit. Here, the fact that I want more is a definite plus rather than a negative. Add to that a perfect, no, I'm serious, I don't think there's a conceivably better way that anyone with an eye for storytelling bordering even remotely on human could have done this better, perfect introduction to and portrayal of the Vision, and all around it's a damn fine cast. The movie is packed to the brim with action scenes and manages to make it so all of them are furthering the story. All but half of one of them. None of them get as big as Avengers or Civil War do in terms of pure indulgent spectacle, but they get as close as is appropriate for this story, and like the first film, my favorite action scene has got to be the climax. The aesthetic is a bit grey compared to the first film, but given the darker tone, I can't really fault it that. It's got my favorite musical theme out of any of these movies, if only for how fitting the mythic bombast is. It retains the original sense of humor, but with a better pace, and honestly I could go on about this movie until I'm blue in the face, then purple in the face, and then till I die, and I'll probably just keep going as a ghost. Woe is the poor soul who ends up being haunted by me. Avengers: Age of Ultron. My favorite MCU film, my favorite film in this genre, and one of my favorite films of all time. What more can I say? So, there's my list. Here's hoping it wasn't a total slog to get through, but hey, I know some of my choices were pretty unconventional, so if your own list varies in any significant ways, why not put it down in the comments along with your reasoning. Like the video if you liked it, also, and maybe even click the screen to subscribe if you're interested in more stuff from me. Or just, hit the subscriber button, that works. Here's to 14 and many more in the future.